Hi, I'm Jim Ward of the Middle Country Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode in our History Bites series. Today, we will discuss the Gemini 4 mission, which occurred 60 years ago this month and featured the first spacewalk by an American, Ed White. Edward Higgins White II was born on November 14, 1930, in San Antonio, Texas. His father, Edward White Sr., was a West Point graduate and accomplished pilot. White Sr. flew U.S. Army airships and some of the first powered military aircraft of the century. Following in his father's footsteps, White graduated from West Point and enlisted in the U.S. Air Force in 1952. He earned his wings and flew the F-86 Sabre and F-100 Super Sabre jet fighters in Germany. Then, the world changed in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, ushering in the space age. Later that year, an article describing the future role of astronauts landed in White's lap. The article was written with tongue-in-cheek, but something told me, this is it. This is the type of thing you're cut out for, White told Life magazine. From then on, everything I did seemed to be preparing me for spaceflight. White left Germany and returned back to the United States with his wife Patricia and two children, Edward and Bonnie Lynn. He earned his master's degree in aeronautical engineering in 1959, the same year NASA selected the original 7 astronauts for Project Mercury. Upon learning that each of them was a test pilot, White decided to join their ranks. White earned his test pilot credentials that year and began flying experimental aircraft at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. His first introduction to NASA was piloting the large cargo planes used to train astronauts for zero-gravity environments. His passengers included John Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth, and Ham, a chimpanzee that was the first hominid in space. Many of the early astronauts knew each other before joining NASA, having crossed paths as military test pilots in the 1950s. Ed White and Jim McDivitt were especially close. After both serving in the Air Force, they met in 1959 at the University of Michigan, where they lived on the same street. They graduated from test pilot school in the same class and were both picked with the second group of NASA astronauts in 1962. So it was natural that they were assigned together to Gemini 4, the first long-duration flight of the 2-man capsule following Gemini 3's 5-hour shakedown flight in March 1965. In a 1999 oral history interview, McDivitt called White, quote, "the best friend I ever had." Gemini 4 was a 4-day flight that would test the limits of spaceflight and would include the first spacewalk in history. The U.S. was determined to take the lead in the race to the moon, but the Soviets surprised the world again. Less than a week before the launch of Gemini 3, Russian cosmonaut Alexei Leonov stepped out of his Voskhod 2 spacecraft to take the title as the first man to walk in space on March 18, 1965. The Soviet Union may have held the lead, but NASA knew that the U.S. was catching up. Not 3 months later, on the morning of June 3, 1965, Gemini 4 lifted off the launch pad atop the Titan II rocket. Shortly after their first orbit, White began preparing for his spacewalk by running through the checklist as he and McDivitt unpacked every piece of equipment inside the cramped capsule. Both astronauts wore spacesuits during the flight, but since White would leave the Gemini vehicle entirely, his suit was a little heavier, with more layers than McDivitt's. During training in a zero-G airplane, and in this McDonnell pressure chamber pumped down to simulate the atmosphere at 150,000 feet, White practiced his egress and ingress from the capsule dozens of times. The crew began depressurizing the cabin when they approached Australia during their third revolution around the Earth. Over Hawaii, White opened the hatch to the dark expanse of space, and with a puff from his maneuvering gun, propelled himself outside the capsule. His only link to the spacecraft was a 25-foot gold-coated tether and an umbilical cord, which supplied him with oxygen. White's handheld maneuvering unit fired a burst of compressed gas to push the astronaut in the desired direction. For such a big moment, White's emergence from the Gemini capsule was something of a comedy of errors. For one thing, the hatch was a struggle to open. For another, communications with Mission Control were confused. The astronauts were using a new voice-activated radio, and when they talked, they couldn't hear Mission Control. That, combined with the expected long silences between ground tracking stations, a common problem in the early space program, resulted in Mission Control missing the first part of the spacewalk. Having earlier received a go from the ground, White stood up in the open hatchway, spent 10 minutes getting his equipment in order, pulled his legs up and over the hatch opening, then fired the zip gun to propel himself out into space, without physically pushing off with his hands or legs. 3 minutes into the spacewalk, Capcom Gus Grissom radioed from Houston. "Has he egressed?" McDivitt answered, "He's out, Gus, and it's really nifty." The zip gun was a last-minute add-on and was touted as more advanced technology than the Soviets had used on Leonov's spacewalk. During and after the flight, White had nothing but praise for the gun. Keeping it close to his body so the thrust went through his center of mass, he could control his position and stop and start his momentum easily. His only regret was that the gun ran out of gas just 4 minutes into a 20-minute spacewalk, leaving him unable to move around except by pulling on his tether. White liked the gun so much that he told NASA debriefers he would trust it for short excursions outside the spacecraft, even without a tether. "I might not tell somebody else to do that," he said, "but I'd be willing." "I feel like $1 million, he told McDivitt, who was sitting 15 feet away inside the capsule, watching. White floated in space, flying more than 100 miles above the Pacific Ocean at speeds exceeding 17,500 miles per hour, yet he felt right at home. He radioed fellow astronaut and Capcom Gus Grissom at Houston. "That's right, Capcom. It's very easy to maneuver with the gun," White said. "This is the greatest experience. It's just tremendous. Right now I'm standing on my head and I'm looking down, and it looks like we're coming up on the coast of California. There is absolutely no disorientation associated with it." In 15 minutes, White traveled from Hawaii to Florida. Soon, they would be over the Atlantic and approaching sunset. Chris Kraft, NASA's flight director at Houston, was worried about White's ability to function in the pitch black of nighttime space. When McDivitt finally asked, "Gus, this is Jim. Got any message for us?" Kraft didn't hesitate to override the communication system and order White to return to the capsule. After some reluctance, White followed the order and began to pull himself back into the capsule. "It's the saddest moment of my life," White conceded as he maneuvered back towards the hatch. The spacewalk lasted a total of 23 minutes, twice as long as Leonov's 10-minute float. Ed White might have been euphoric during his spacewalk, but whatever he felt was tame compared to the American public's reaction, Kraft wrote in his book, Flight, My Life in Mission Control. The country went wild with excitement over their space program. Ed's spacewalk completely eclipsed the Russians. "For the first time, I saw real optimism out there over our chances of winning the race to the moon." After the spacewalk, the Gemini 4 crew spent another 3.5 days in orbit, running experiments on everything from radiation levels in the capsule to photography of the Earth below. More important, they proved that astronauts could return perfectly healthy after a long bout of weightlessness. Despite the glitches, or maybe because of them, NASA had learned a few things about spacewalking. As McDivitt told an interviewer decades later, "We would have never gotten to the moon when we did if we'd taken baby steps all the way." White and McDivitt spent 4 days in the Gemini spacecraft, making 62 orbits around the world and covering a total of 1,609,700 miles before they safely touched down in the Atlantic Ocean. Having proved himself during Gemini 4, NASA selected White to be senior pilot for the first Apollo mission. He was joined by Gus Grissom as command pilot and Roger Chaffee as pilot. Apollo 1 would test the new 3-man Apollo Command Module while in Earth's orbit to prepare for future missions to the moon. On January 27, 1967, the crew entered the Apollo 1 Command Module for a dry test on the launch pad. From the start, the practice test was plagued by issues, including the capsule's communication system. Out of frustration, Grissom exclaimed, How are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 3 buildings? A minute later, tragedy struck. At 6:31 p.m., the word flames was heard over the radio from one of the astronauts. In a matter of seconds, the pure oxygen environment of the cabin caused the flames to fill the entire capsule. The fire took the lives of all 3 astronauts inside. White was buried with full military honors at West Point Cemetery. In 1997, President Bill Clinton posthumously awarded White the Congressional Space Medal of Honor. Thank you for joining us for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, click like, and if you watched on YouTube, hit subscribe. Thanks so much, and we'll see you all next time.